modern superheroes.
Imagine standing on the edge of a vast system of power, a system so all-consuming that it could destroy a life with a single command. Yet, one man chose to defy it. This is Mikhail Savostin, an ordinary man on the surface, but beneath that unassuming exterior lay an iron will and a relentless drive for justice. He didn't carry weapons or wield influence in high places. His power was his courage, his conviction that no person should be crushed simply for speaking the truth. In Russia, where even whispers of dissent are met with shadows that stretch from government offices to crowded city streets, Mikhail became a symbol of defiance. He saw people silenced, families shattered, and livelihoods destroyed, all because they dared to question authority. But unlike others who were beaten down by fear, Mikhail made a choice. He chose to be the voice that couldn't be silenced. He was more than a single man. He became a symbol, a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. He chose courage over silence, even when he knew the cost could be his freedom or his life. This is the story of one man's battle against a machine built to oppress, his journey from a small-town activist to a relentless hero standing in the face of tyranny. To understand Mikhail Savostin's journey, you first have to understand the environment he grew up in, a place where corruption wasn't hidden in the shadows but out in the open, seeping into every corner of daily life. In his hometown of Mineralny Vody, like in many parts of Russia, government authority wasn't there to serve the people, but to control them. The law was a tool wielded by the powerful to suppress dissent, to silence questions, and to protect those with influence. Bribes were routine, and officials were untouchable. Mikhail saw, from a young age, how people with wealth and connections could manipulate the system, while ordinary citizens were left defenseless against injustice. For most, this was simply the reality of life, a reality to be accepted, endured in silence. But for Mikhail, something felt deeply wrong. His sense of justice clashed with the cynicism around him. He couldn't ignore the disparity between those who enforced the law and those who suffered from it. He started to see that this wasn't just a series of individual injustices. It was a system built on exploitation and fear. As he grew older, Mikhail's awareness of this corruption grew into a profound sense of responsibility. He felt compelled to challenge the unfairness that surrounded him, to stand up for the voiceless. And he knew, even then, that this path would not be easy. In Russia, questioning authority often came with a steep price, a price he would soon come to know. But this knowledge only strengthened his resolve. For Mikhail, the risks of challenging a broken system were outweighed by the greater risk of staying silent. This was the world that shaped Mikhail's beliefs, a world where justice was scarce and courage was costly. It was here, in the heart of corruption, that his journey began. But Mikhail's journey was just beginning. His decision to speak out was like striking a match in a dark, silent room, and it quickly drew the attention of those who would stop at nothing to snuff it out. He faced relentless scrutiny, his every move watched, his words twisted into accusations. In time, the system would come for him, determined to silence him by any means necessary. False charges, brutal interrogations, and a courtroom where the verdict was decided before he'd even entered. Mikhail would learn firsthand what it meant to be an enemy of the state, thrown into a prison designed to break him, physically, mentally, completely. Yet, somehow, he endured. In those dark cells, he discovered a resilience he never knew he had, finding strength in moments of unimaginable hardship. But prison was only one chapter. Mikhail's fight would take him across borders, into exile, as he became a symbol of resistance against corruption that knew no boundaries. This is a story of a man forced to leave behind everything he knew, friends, family, his home, to escape the grasp of a system that would rather see him disappear than let the truth be told. And even now, in exile, he continues his battle, undeterred by the miles between him and his homeland. But how did he survive? How did he manage to escape the clutches of a regime that seemed to control everything? And what drives him to keep fighting, even now? Mikhail Savostin was born and raised in Mineralny Vody, a place known for its natural beauty but shadowed by a harsh reality. In this small town, corruption wasn't some hidden crime. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life. From the local markets to government offices, he saw how those in power operated above the law. Officials demanded bribes without a second thought. Services were offered only to those who could pay. And decisions that affected people's lives were made in back rooms, behind closed doors. As he grew up, Mikhail watched people he knew suffer because they didn't have the means to play this game. Friends lost their jobs, families struggled to make ends meet, and neighbors were forced to look the other way, powerless to change the corrupt system that controlled their lives. But for Mikhail, this wasn't something he could ignore. It wasn't just unfair. it was fundamentally wrong. The first incident that would shape his resolve happened when he was just a teenager. He saw a local shopkeeper, a man who had worked honestly for years, accused of a crime he hadn't committed. Mikhail watched as the police, under the influence of powerful figures, planted evidence to convict him. The shopkeeper's only crime was refusing to pay for protection. It was then, seeing the look of desperation in that man's eyes, that Mikhail felt a deep, unshakable anger. He realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that preyed on the vulnerable. This experience ignited something in him, a sense of duty to speak up, to expose what others were afraid to acknowledge. He began talking openly about the corruption he saw, questioning why justice seemed reserved for the highest bidder. His words, at first, were met with disbelief or silent nods, but over time, people began to listen. They saw in him a voice that echoed their own frustrations, their own sense of betrayal. But with that attention came the risk. Friends warned him, whispering that it was dangerous to stir up trouble, especially against the kind of people who had everything to lose. Mikhail knew the risks, but something stronger than fear pushed him forward. In that small town where others felt powerless, he believed that silence was a greater danger. Standing by and watching injustice unfold was not an option. So he took his first steps as an activist, unaware of the journey ahead, but determined to make a difference, however small. This was the spark, the moment he realized that if no one else would speak up, he would. And from that spark, a fire was born. As Mikhail's frustration with the injustices in Mineralny Vody grew, so did his resolve to take action. Speaking out was one thing, but Mikhail realized he needed more than words to create change. He needed a movement. He couldn't stand alone if he was going to challenge a system this powerful. And so, he began reaching out to others. People he knew felt the same way, yet had been forced into silence by fear. Mikhail's passion and determination were contagious. He began to gather a small group of locals, neighbors, shopkeepers, workers, ordinary people who had all been victims or witnesses of corruption in some way. They started meeting in secret, discussing their experiences and how they could fight back. For the first time, people in the community felt they weren't alone. Together, they shared stories of injustice, each account fueling their desire to see real change. It was here, in these quiet gatherings, that Mikhail's natural leadership emerged. He wasn't just a voice of dissent, he was someone who inspired trust. He listened to others, strategized, and offered a vision of what their community could be if they united. Under his guidance, this small network grew stronger. It was no longer just about speaking up, it was about taking collective action. Their first campaign was modest but bold. Mikhail organized a protest against the local police department, calling them out for their abuse of power and the way they manipulated justice for their own gain. The protest was small, but it was the first of its kind. People gathered, carrying signs, chanting for accountability, and for the first time, the authorities knew they were being watched. Mikhail's message was clear: corruption would no longer go unchecked, and those who had suffered in silence now had a voice. This early act of defiance didn't go unnoticed. The authorities, once comfortable in their untouchable positions, began to feel the pressure. But more importantly, others in the community took notice too. People who had felt isolated and powerless saw in Mikhail and his group a glimmer of hope. Soon, more joined the cause, drawn by his unwavering commitment to justice and his belief that they could make a difference. Mikhail's movement became a force in Mineralny Vody, a beacon of courage and a challenge to those who thought their power was unassailable. He had sparked something larger than himself, a community bound by the shared belief that they deserved better. In Mikhail, they saw more than a leader. They saw a man willing to stand on the front lines for a fairer, just future. And with each step, his movement grew stronger, setting the stage for the battles that would follow. As Mikhail's movement grew, so did the risks he faced, risks that didn't just threaten him but extended to his family and everything he held dear. Standing up to a corrupt system meant confronting people with power, people who weren't used to being challenged, and they had their ways of pushing back, of reminding him that he was putting not only himself but his loved ones in danger. At first, the warnings were subtle. A strange phone call here, a veiled threat there. But as Mikhail's influence spread, the threats became harder to ignore. His family was harassed. Strangers would follow his wife and children in the streets. One evening, he returned home to find his windows shattered, a message that was impossible to misunderstand. The authorities wanted him to know that his actions had consequences, and they were prepared to make his life difficult in any way they could. The toll of this constant pressure was heavy. Mikhail's family began living under a cloud of fear. His wife worried every time he left the house, not knowing if he would be arrested or worse. His children, though young, sensed the tension that filled their home. They couldn't understand why their father was always on edge, why the family seemed isolated from the rest of the community. And Mikhail, torn between his love for his family and his commitment to justice, found himself questioning the impact his fight was having on the people closest to him. Financially, things were no easier. His activism and the backlash it provoked meant he could no longer hold a stable job. Employers saw him as a troublemaker, a risk they couldn't afford to take on. With every passing month, the strain on their finances grew. There were times when he wondered if it was worth it, if he was risking too much, if he was putting his family's safety and future on the line for a fight that seemed impossible to win. But even in those darkest moments, something in him refused to give up. Mikhail tried to shield his family from the worst of it, but he knew they felt the impact of every battle he fought. He saw the exhaustion in his wife's eyes, the worry etched into her face as she tried to hold their household together under the weight of his cause. Yet, despite it all, she stood by him. She knew, as he did, that there was no turning back. She had married a man of principles, a man who could not ignore injustice, even if it meant sacrificing everything. And in her own quiet way, she became a part of his fight, offering him strength when he felt his resolve begin to falter. The price of his activism was steep: financial hardship, constant fear, and the knowledge that any day they could lose everything. But Mikhail knew that his family understood, that they shared his belief that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And so, with each passing day, he continued his work, carrying the weight of his family's sacrifice with him, knowing that every step he took in this battle for justice was also a step towards securing a better future for them. A future where they could live without fear. Despite the threats, the hardships, and the constant danger to his family, Mikhail's dedication to his community never wavered. He continued to stand up, not just for his own principles, but for the people who had long felt abandoned and ignored. And little by little, his efforts began to bear fruit, creating a ripple effect of change that transformed his community. One of his first successful campaigns was as simple as it was symbolic. The roads in Mineral Vody had been neglected for years, full of potholes that made travel difficult and dangerous. Residents had complained for as long as they could remember, but the local authorities only ever offered excuses. Road repairs were too expensive, they claimed, or low on the priority list. But everyone knew the truth. The money earmarked for such projects was lining the pockets of officials, disappearing before it could reach the people who needed it. Mikhail decided that enough was enough. He organized a petition, gathering signatures from hundreds of residents, and took their demands straight to the town council. When they ignored him, he rallied the community to protest outside government offices, holding signs that demanded accountability. News of the protest spread, attracting the attention of local media, and soon officials could no longer hide behind their excuses. Under the weight of public pressure, they finally allocated funds to repair the roads. For the first time, the people of Mineral Vody saw a victory. A small but significant sign that their voices mattered, that someone was fighting for them. But Mikhail didn't stop there. As word of his success spread, more residents came forward, sharing stories of corruption and neglect they had experienced firsthand. He began leading community meetings, where people could openly discuss the issues that affected their daily lives. They talked about how certain businesses were favored with tax breaks while others were hit with unfair inspections and fines, how police officers demanded bribes, how school funding was mysteriously redirected. Each story fueled Mikhail's resolve and strengthened his determination to hold those in power accountable. One of the most impactful campaigns he led was to expose a scheme in which government officials were siphoning funds meant for the local hospital. People were suffering due to a lack of basic medical supplies, and patients were turned away because there weren't enough beds. Through his network, Mikhail uncovered documents showing that hospital funding had been redirected to private accounts belonging to high-ranking officials. With this evidence, he organized a public awareness campaign, distributing leaflets and hosting town hall meetings. The scandal rocked the community, and the authorities, unable to contain the outrage, were forced to make a rare admission of guilt. Several officials were dismissed, and funds were restored to the hospital, bringing immediate relief to residents who had endured substandard healthcare for too long. These victories earned Mikhail immense respect among the people of Mineral Vody. For the first time, they felt empowered to speak out, to challenge the system that had oppressed them for so long. Mikhail became more than an activist. He became a local hero, a symbol of hope and resilience. People who had once whispered about injustice in private were now openly voicing their grievances, emboldened by the change they saw happening around them. His work reminded them that even the smallest actions, when fueled by courage and unity, could could lead to profound change. In a place where fear had kept people silent for years, Mikhail's victories lit a fire that couldn't easily be extinguished. And as his influence grew, so did the watchful eyes of those determined to stop him. As Mikhail's influence grew, so did the fear among those who had built their careers on the unchecked power and corruption that plagued Mineralnaya Vodi. He wasn't just an outspoken citizen anymore. He had become a threat, someone whose relentless drive for justice could unravel the system they had carefully built to serve themselves. And so, one by one, the powerful began to close ranks against him. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to overlook. It started with whispers and suspicious glances in town meetings. Former acquaintances, once eager to shake his hand, now avoided his gaze. Local officials, once indifferent, now spoke to him with a polite coldness, as if acknowledging an enemy. Mikhail quickly realized he was being watched, and not just by strangers, by people he had once considered friends, who were now too afraid to be seen with him. One evening, after a late meeting with fellow activists, Mikhail noticed an unmarked car idling across from his house. He tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but the car appeared again the next night, and then again at the market, and even as he walked his children to school. It was never the same person behind the wheel, but they had the same look, a cold, expressionless stare that told him everything he needed to know. They were there as a warning. Soon after, the phone call started. At odd hours, the phone would ring, and when Mikhail answered, there would be nothing but silence. Sometimes he heard faint breathing or the sound of shuffling papers, as if someone on the other end wanted him to know they were listening. Conversations with friends or allies would inexplicably drop, only to reconnect with faint crackles, making it clear that his phone was tapped. His emails became unreliable. Some would disappear entirely, while others seemed altered, as if someone was reading and rewriting his words. But the threats weren't limited to quiet surveillance. The authorities were beginning to pressure him more directly. One night, as he left a small protest gathering in the town square, two plainclothes police officers approached him. They acted casual, almost friendly, but their eyes betrayed a harder intent. They warned him that his activities had drawn the attention of important people and suggested, for his own good, that he should take a break from his activism. They assured him that nothing would happen if he just stopped. No more protests, no more speaking out. It was a thinly veiled threat, a quiet ultimatum to give up his cause or face the consequences. When he ignored their warning, the pressure intensified. Officials began to spread rumors about him, labeling him a troublemaker, a man who was only stirring up issues for his own gain. They hinted that he was working with foreign interests or accused him of trying to destabilize the community. Mikhail could feel the social isolation growing, as former supporters now hesitated to associate with him, wary of being caught in his wake. But the officials went further, targeting those close to him. His wife's friends started receiving friendly visits from police officers, casually mentioning that her husband was making waves and that it might be best to keep their distance. Then came the intimidation of his allies. One of his closest friends and fellow activists, Sergei, was pulled aside by local police and warned that any involvement with Mikhail would jeopardize his business. "Think about your family," they told him, their words dripping with threat. Another supporter found himself inexplicably targeted for tax audits, his business tied up in red tape that appeared out of nowhere. Mikhail watched as the people who had stood with him grew quieter, their resolve chipped away by a system that knew exactly how to make them afraid. But the most personal attack came one cold evening as Mikhail returned home to find his front door slightly ajar. His heart pounded as he stepped inside, finding his living room in disarray. Drawers had been pulled open, papers scattered everywhere. It wasn't a burglary. Nothing was taken, but someone had been there, sending him a message. As he walked into the kitchen, he noticed a small, crumpled note left on the counter. "We know where you live. Stop now, or your family will pay." For a moment, Mikhail felt the weight of his decision bearing down on him. He had always understood the risks, but now the danger felt closer, more immediate. The people he was fighting weren't just bureaucrats. They were powerful individuals who would go to any lengths to protect their interests, and they had made it clear that they were willing to target his family to break him. He felt a surge of fear, but as he looked around his home, he realized that this only strengthened his resolve. His family was why he had started this fight in the first place. How could he surrender now? The authorities didn't stop there. The police began to treat him not as a citizen, but as a threat. His home was randomly searched, his paperwork constantly checked for irregularities. He was summoned to the station repeatedly, each time for vague reasons that melted into new accusations. Every visit was a reminder that his every move was being watched, that they were waiting for him to slip up. But Mikhail remained defiant, facing each new attempt to intimidate him with the same calm determination. He would not be silenced. Mikhail's fight for justice had earned him powerful enemies, men with the resources to make his life a living nightmare. But he also knew that with every threat, every attempt to scare him into silence, he was getting closer to exposing them. He was becoming the voice that couldn't be ignored, the thorn they couldn't remove, and he wore their hatred as a badge of honor, a sign that he was fighting the right fight. The people of Mineralny Vodi watched with a mix of fear and awe as Mikhail stood up to the full weight of corruption. But while he had made a difference, his battle was far from over. The system he had challenged was determined to strike back harder, and Mikhail knew that what lay ahead would test him like never before. The more Mikhail pushed, the more intense the threats became. By now, the subtle signs of surveillance had transformed into an undeniable presence, a shadow that followed him wherever he went. He couldn't escape the feeling of eyes watching his every move, ears listening to every word he said. The stakes were rising, and Mikhail knew he was treading dangerous ground. It started with strange encounters in public places. He'd be at the market, and as he reached for his phone to make a call, he'd see someone just a few steps away, clearly observing him. He'd move to a quieter area, only to notice another figure watching just as intently. Each time he changed locations, they would follow. He'd turn a corner and catch a fleeting glimpse of a stranger who quickly looked away. These weren't coincidences. They were reminders that he was never alone, that every step he took was being documented, every interaction carefully monitored. Even in his own home, the feeling of safety was slipping away. Mikhail began noticing that objects in his home had been moved, like his belongings had been shifted just slightly. The intrusion was silent, but unmistakable. One evening, he returned from a meeting to find his front door unlocked. Inside, he could sense that someone had been there, someone who left no trace except for the quiet certainty that his home was no longer his sanctuary. They wanted him to feel their presence, to know that nowhere was safe. The harassment grew more direct. His phone would ring at odd hours, and each time he answered, there was only silence, an empty line filled with faint static. The sound of someone listening, waiting. Conversations with his closest allies were punctuated by strange clicks and interruptions. Sometimes, in the middle of a discussion about their next move, the line would cut out entirely, only to reconnect a moment later with an eerie, uncomfortable silence. Mikhail knew this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated tactic to remind him that he was under constant watch. But the escalation didn't stop there. The authorities seemed determined to break him, to prove that they could reach him anywhere. As he walked down familiar streets, people would turn away as he passed, their eyes avoiding his. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings. Neighbors crossed to the other side of the road. It was as if his very presence had become toxic, a reminder of the danger that now surrounded him. Mikhail realized that the people around him had been pressured too, that his fight was costing not only him but everyone in his orbit. The tension finally broke one night after a community meeting. Mikhail was heading home along a dimly lit road when two men in dark coats stepped out from the shadows. They positioned themselves in his path, blocking his way. There was no mistaking who they were, plainclothes officers, men who answered to the very people Mikhail was challenging. They didn't need uniforms to make their intentions clear. Mikhail's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone calm despite the tension in the air. One of the men smirked, looking him over with a mix of disdain and amusement. "You've been causing quite a stir," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Some people think it's time you stopped. For your own good." Mikhail didn't flinch. He met their gaze, refusing to show fear. "I'm just speaking the truth," he replied. "Since when is that a crime?" The second man stepped closer, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "In this town, troublemakers don't last long. You'd be wise to remember that." He paused to remember that. He paused to remember that. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air before continuing. "Consider this your last warning. Keep quiet, or we'll make sure you regret it." The men left him standing there in the darkness, their words echoing in his mind. For the first time, Mikhail felt a pang of genuine fear, not for himself, but for his family. The message was clear. This was no longer a game of silent intimidation. The authorities were done with subtlety. They wanted him to know they could act at any moment, that the consequences of defiance would be severe. From that night on, Mikhail's life took on a new intensity. He knew he was stepping into a confrontation that could end badly for him, but he couldn't turn back. The people he was challenging weren't just bureaucrats. They were willing to use any means necessary to protect their power, even if it meant destroying lives. But Mikhail's spirit remained unbroken. If anything, the encounter fueled his resolve. If they were willing to go to such lengths to stop him, then his fight was more important than ever. The lines had been drawn. Mikhail was no longer just an activist. He was a marked man, a target in a battle that had become deeply personal. And as he prepared for what lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. The cost of justice would only grow, but he would pay it, whatever it took. As Mikhail's movement gained momentum, the authorities decided they had waited long enough. His persistence had gone from being an annoyance to a genuine threat, and they were determined to silence him once and for all. They knew that as long as he was free, their secrets weren't safe. And so, they devised a plan to remove him in the simplest way they knew, by making him a criminal. One evening, Mikhail received an anonymous tip that he was to be questioned by the police. He knew what that meant. This wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. The next morning, 2 officers arrived at his door with a warrant, their expressions cold and unreadable. He wasn't under arrest, they assured him, just wanted for routine questioning. But as he walked out of his home, he could see the nervous glances of his neighbors, watching from their windows. The unspoken words hung in the air. This was only the beginning. At the police station, they wasted no time. The questions came quickly, laced with accusations that grew more absurd with each passing hour. They claimed he had stolen funds, incited violence, even conspired against the state. Every charge was a fabrication, but they delivered each one with a grim seriousness, as if the truth no longer mattered. They wanted him guilty, and that was all they needed. Mikhail realized this wasn't an interrogation, it was a performance, one designed to justify what was coming next. Within hours, they had drawn up a case against him, complete with witnesses he had never met and documents he had never signed. In the eyes of the law, he was now a criminal. The charges were absurd, but they were enough to drag him into the judicial system, enough to stain his reputation and remove him from public life. As the officers led him down the hallway toward a holding cell, Mikhail felt a wave of helplessness. He understood that this was only the beginning of a new, darker chapter. They had framed him, creating a web of lies to trap him, a net he couldn't escape. He was now at the mercy of a system that answered to the very people he had fought against. In that moment, Mikhail knew that this wasn't just an attack on him. It was a message to anyone who dared to question authority. They had gone to extraordinary lengths to silence him, but he vowed, even then, that they would not break his spirit. When Mikhail's day in court arrived, he walked into the courtroom knowing that justice was not on the agenda. From the moment he entered, the atmosphere felt heavy with inevitability. He saw it in the faces of the officials who filled the front row, men whose expressions were flat and unfeeling, as if they were merely here to witness the final act of a play they had written themselves. As the trial began, the judge made little attempt to hide his bias. Every objection Mikhail's attorney raised was dismissed almost instantly. Every piece of evidence in Mikhail's favor was deemed irrelevant. Witnesses who had never seen or met Mikhail were paraded through the court, each one reciting the same rehearsed accusations. They claimed he had conspired against the government, that he had incited violence, that he was a danger to public order. It was all scripted, and the judge seemed as much a part of the performance as the witnesses themselves. Mikhail sat there, a spectator in his own trial, watching as his character was assassinated piece by piece. He wanted to speak out, to tell the courtroom that this was all a lie, that the evidence had been manufactured. But every time he opened his mouth, the judge would cut him off, reminding him of courtroom decorum and the proper procedures. It was as if he was expected to simply sit there and accept his fate without a word. The prosecutor's words dripped with venom as he painted Mikhail as a dangerous agitator. He accused Mikhail of destabilizing the community, of working with foreign agents, even suggesting that he was a threat to national security. It was a performance crafted for maximum impact, designed to strip Mikhail of any shred of credibility in the eyes of the public. And with each accusation, Mikhail felt his frustration build. He knew the truth, and he knew they knew it too. But the truth didn't matter here. As the hours dragged on, Mikhail's hope faded. He realized that every person in the room, judge, prosecutor, even the stenographer, was part of a machine designed to silence him. This wasn't a trial, it was a warning. A warning to anyone who thought they could stand up to power, who believed that justice could be found within the walls of this courthouse. The final blow came with the judge's verdict, a pronouncement delivered without hesitation, as if it had been decided long before Mikhail ever set foot in the courtroom. Guilty. The word hung in the air, echoing in Mikhail's mind. Guilty, not for anything he had actually done, but for daring to challenge those in power. As the guards moved to escort him out, Mikhail felt a mix of anger and helplessness. The trial had stripped him not only of his freedom, but of his very right to defend himself. And yet, as he looked back at the faces of those who had conspired against him, he felt a flicker of defiance. They may have stolen his freedom, but they hadn't broken his spirit. Not yet. This was no longer just a battle for his own innocence. It was a battle against an entire system built on lies and intimidation, a system that he was now more determined than ever to expose, no matter what it would cost him. As Mikhail sat alone in his cell that night, the weight of the day crashed over him like a wave. He replayed every moment of the trial in his mind, every accusation, every lie that had been told to strip him of his freedom. His mind buzzed with anger, a deep, simmering rage at the betrayal he had endured, not just from the officials who orchestrated his arrest, but from a system he had once believed could be fair, or at the very least accountable. In the silence of his cell, the reality settled in. He was now a convicted man, branded as an enemy of the state. He thought of his family, his wife and children, and the shame they might be feeling, knowing he'd been publicly denounced and humiliated. It tore at him, this feeling that his fight for justice had somehow dragged them into a nightmare. The thought stung, but with it came a renewed sense of purpose. He knew why he had started this battle, and he knew that the only way forward was to keep fighting. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. He questioned if all of this was worth it. The lost freedom, the risks his family had been forced to endure, the price of standing alone against an all-powerful system. But that doubt was fleeting, quickly replaced by something stronger, a steely resolve. Mikhail understood that this was exactly what they wanted, for him to feel isolated, powerless, broken. But he refused to give them that victory. If they had expected him to surrender, they would soon realize how wrong they were. His thoughts turned to the people he had been fighting for, the quiet faces in the community who had whispered their thanks to him, too afraid to speak out themselves. He thought of the promises he had made to them, the belief he had instilled that things could be different. And in that moment, his anger transformed into something far more powerful, determination. If he stopped now, if he let them break him, everything he had fought for would be lost. Alone in the darkness, Mikhail made a silent vow. No matter how many cells they locked him in, no matter how many lies they spread about him, he would not be silenced. They could strip him of his freedom, but they could not take away his conviction. He would endure whatever came next, not just for himself, but for all those who looked to him as a beacon of hope. This was not the end of his fight. It was only the beginning of a deeper struggle, one that would test every part of him. And he was ready. Mikhail's first days in prison were a brutal awakening. The cold, unwelcoming walls of his cell seemed to close in on him, stark reminders of the life he had been forced to leave behind. The cell was small and barren, barely more than a concrete box with a thin, worn mattress and a dim, flickering light that cast shadows on the walls. The air was thick, heavy with the staleness of confinement, and the cold seemed to seep into his bones. Each morning, he awoke to the harsh clang of metal as the guards made their rounds, barking orders and hurrying prisoners through the motions of the day. There was no privacy, no space to retreat from the constant watch of guards who seemed more interested in intimidation than order. Every day was a cycle of control, isolation, and survival. He quickly realized that, in here, the smallest acts of independence were seen as threats. Even standing too close to another prisoner during meals could bring punishment. The daily routines were harsh, deliberately designed to strip the prisoners of dignity. Meals were barely edible, thin porridge in the morning, stale bread at lunch, and watery soup at night. Just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to truly nourish them. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at him as he lay awake at night, listening to the muffled sounds of others shifting in their bunks, as restless as he was. But the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the mental toll. Cut off from his family, from the cause he had dedicated his life to, he felt the heavy weight of isolation settling over him. Days blurred together in the endless monotony, with only the echo of his own thoughts for company. Without the sounds and sights of the outside world, without even a sliver of freedom, he found himself questioning how long he could endure this place. The absence of any news, any contact, any sense of the world beyond these walls made the prison feel like a different universe, one detached from reality. The guards seemed to take pleasure in reminding him of his helplessness. They would taunt him, reminding him of the life he'd left behind, telling him that people had already forgotten him. They whispered that his family had moved on, that his allies had abandoned his cause. Some days, they even went so far as to tell him that his sentence would never end, that he'd rot within these walls until he faded from memory entirely. Mikhail knew these were lies meant to break his spirit, but in the depths of isolation, even the most obvious lies had a way of creeping into his mind. He quickly learned that survival here wasn't just about enduring the physical discomfort. It was about keeping his mind intact, holding on to the sense of self that his captors were determined to strip away. Small acts of resilience became his lifeline. Sometimes he would spend hours tracing invisible patterns on the walls, reminding himself of the world outside. Other times, he would silently recite memories of his family, clinging to their faces, their voices, as if they were talismans against the darkness that surrounded him. But he also knew he couldn't retreat entirely into his own mind. In a place like this, isolation was dangerous, but trust was even rarer. Many of the other prisoners were wary, their eyes hardened by years of confinement. Some had given up long ago, their spirits crushed by the relentless grind of survival. Others, like Mikhail, held a quiet defiance, but they had learned to keep it hidden, knowing that defiance, even in thought, could be a dangerous thing to reveal. For Mikhail, the days of isolation became battles of the mind, tests of endurance. Every hour was a struggle to hold on to his beliefs, to remember why he was here, to resist the slow erosion of self that this place seemed designed to inflict. The prison's routine was designed to break men, to reduce them to shadows of who they once were. But Mikhail was determined to resist. No matter how many days passed, he clung to one simple truth. He was here because he had stood for something. And as long as he remembered that, he knew they could never truly imprison him. Even in this dark place, stripped of freedom, he held on to the one thing they couldn't take, his purpose. And that purpose became his shield, his reason to endure another day, and then another. At first, Mikhail kept to himself, maintaining a cautious distance from the other prisoners. Trust, after all, was hard to come by in a place where survival often meant looking out for oneself. But gradually, he began to observe the men around him, sensing an unspoken bond of resilience shared by those who had been beaten down by the same system. Despite their differences, he recognized in many of them a quiet defiance, a spark that, like his own, refused to be extinguished. One day, during a particularly grueling shift in the prison's workshop, an old inmate, Sergei, collapsed from exhaustion. The guard sneered, barely glancing at the man as he lay on the cold, concrete floor. Without thinking, Mikhail stepped forward, helping Sergei to his feet despite the guard's shouts. It was a small gesture, but it didn't go unnoticed. For the first time, Mikhail felt the eyes of his fellow prisoners watching him, a glimmer of respect forming in their gazes. He had taken a risk, one that could have earned him punishment, but it was worth it. The silent gratitude in Sergei's eyes was the beginning of something deeper, a trust that, in this place, was both precious and rare. Over time, Mikhail's acts of solidarity became known among the prisoners. He listened to their stories, their fears, their frustrations, and offered them quiet words of encouragement. He knew the weight they all carried, the memories of lives left behind, families separated, dreams shattered by a system that saw them as nothing more than numbers in a file. And he realized that, even here, in the bleakness of prison, he could still be a voice for those who had lost hope. Slowly, men began to approach him, drawn by his quiet strength. They saw in Mikhail someone who hadn't given up, someone who still believed in something greater than the prison walls that held them. In whispered conversations during work shifts or in fleeting exchanges during mealtimes, they shared stories of injustice, of how they too had been ensnared by a corrupt system that profited from their suffering. And in Mikhail, they found not only a listener but a leader, a beacon of resilience in a place designed to crush the human spirit. One night, in the dim silence of the cell block, a group of inmates gathered around Mikhail's cell. They spoke in hushed voices, careful to avoid the attention of the guards, and shared their visions of what life could be like beyond these walls. They talked about justice, about freedom, about a world where people didn't have to live in fear. Mikhail listened, offering them a flicker of hope, reminding them that their lives still held meaning, even here. He told them that the system they were fighting wasn't invincible, that outside these walls, people were beginning to see the truth, to understand the cost of the corruption they had suffered under. As the weeks passed, Mikhail became something of a symbol within the prison, a source of strength for those who had all but forgotten what it meant to believe in something. He didn't preach or boast, he simply stood firm, embodying the principles that had brought him here, and the men respected him for it. In small ways, they began to follow his example, supporting each other where they could, sharing what little they had, forming a quiet network of solidarity in the most unlikely of places. Mikhail knew the risks of this alliance. He knew that any sign of unity among the prisoners was a threat to the guards, who relied on division and fear to maintain control. But he also knew that they needed each other, that this bond was the only way to keep their humanity intact. Together, they became a community, one that found strength in numbers, hope in shared stories, and courage in the example Mikhail set each day. The guards noticed the change. They saw the glances exchanged between prisoners, the subtle acts of defiance. And they understood that Mikhail was the heart of this quiet rebellion. They tried to break it, separating him from the others, moving him to different shifts, isolating him whenever they could. But by then, it was too late. The spirit of solidarity had taken root, and even in his absence, Mikhail's influence remained. In a place built to strip men of their dignity, Mikhail had given them something priceless, the belief that they were not alone, that their suffering had purpose, that even in darkness, they could find light in each other. The guards soon realized that Mikhail wasn't like most prisoners. No matter what they did, he refused to submit, his spirit remaining unbroken by the harsh conditions and constant surveillance. His quiet defiance became a thorn in their side, a reminder that not everyone in their grasp would bend to their will. And while Mikhail was careful not to provoke out rebellion, he found ways to remind them that, even in prison, he still had a voice. One day, as the prisoners were lined up for inspection, a guard noticed that Mikhail was carrying a piece of chalk he had found in the workshop. The guard demanded he hand it over, knowing that even something as harmless as chalk could be seen as a tool for dissent. But Mikhail refused, calmly explaining that he'd done nothing wrong. The guard grew angry, threatening him with solitary confinement, but Mikhail met his gaze with steady defiance, refusing to surrender. In the end, they forced him into a small isolation cell for 3 days, a punishment meant to break him down. But even in solitude, Mikhail found strength in his principles, emerging with the same quiet resolve that had become his hallmark. The guards tried to isolate him further, monitoring his every move, but he continued to find small ways to defy them. During mealtimes, he'd quietly pass his bread to a younger prisoner who looked weaker, his small act of solidarity a silent statement that he would not let the system dictate his humanity. When the guards tried to break up conversations between him and his fellow inmates, he'd find ways to communicate through subtle gestures, nods, and glances. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that he couldn't be silenced. Then, there were the confrontations with prison officials. One day, a high-ranking officer made his rounds, pausing by Mikhail's cell to deliver a thinly veiled warning. "You're wasting your time," he sneered. "No one remembers you out there. You're just another criminal now, locked away where you belong." Mikhail could feel the anger rise within him, but he refused to show it. Instead, he met the officer's gaze and replied calmly, "Then you have nothing to fear from me, do you?" His words were a challenge, a reminder that he was still a man of conviction, that they hadn't erased who he was. The officer's face hardened, but he moved on, leaving Mikhail with the small victory of knowing he had refused to let them see him break. These acts of defiance, though small, became lifelines for Mikhail and the men around him. They saw his courage and began to emulate it in their own ways, refusing to let the prison system strip them of their dignity. Some began sharing their food with each other. Others took quiet risks to pass messages along. Mikhail's courage had become contagious, spreading among the prisoners in ways the guards couldn't fully control. One night, as they lined up for head count, Mikhail overheard a guard mocking him to another officer, referring to him as the martyr, laughing about how his spirit would fade eventually. Mikhail couldn't resist. With a calm but firm voice, he replied, "Martyrs are remembered for a reason." The guard was stunned, momentarily thrown off by Mikhail's response, and the other prisoners, standing in line, stifled grins. It was a small, fleeting moment, but one that filled Mikhail with a renewed sense of strength. They could imprison his body, but his mind, his words, those remained free. In these small victories, Mikhail found his strength, each act of defiance a reminder that his spirit was still intact. Every day he pushed back, refusing to let them strip away his identity, his beliefs, his voice. And while the prison officials tried to control him, each failed attempt only confirmed what he had known all along. His imprisonment was a battle, and he was far from finished. These small acts of resistance were more than gestures, they were declarations. Mikhail was still a free man, in mind and in spirit. And as he looked ahead, he knew this prison wouldn't be the end of his journey. His fight for justice had only just begun. When Mikhail was finally released, he stepped out of the prison gates into a world that felt both familiar and strangely foreign. The weight of freedom felt different this time, more fragile, tainted by the knowledge of what he had endured and the constant reminder that his release was not a victory, just a temporary reprieve. He was no longer the same man who had entered those walls. He was stronger, but he was also marked. And he quickly discovered that his release did not mean he was truly free. Back in Mineralny Vody, he found that the authorities had not forgotten him. He was met with distrust and suspicion, as if he was still branded with the labels they'd forced on him during his trial. Old friends greeted him cautiously, their voices hushed, eyes darting around to see who might be watching. Some whispered their support, but others had distanced themselves, fearful of the repercussions of associating with a man the government had labeled a traitor. Rebuilding his life was harder than he'd imagined. Employment was out of reach, his name blacklisted from any position of influence or stability. He tried to find work, but employers turned him away, wary of hiring someone with a history of subversion. The stigma followed him everywhere he went, and he realized that the authorities had woven a web of barriers around him, making sure his reintegration would be as difficult as possible. Every door he knocked on seemed to close before he could even explain himself. But the hardest part wasn't the isolation or the financial strain. It was the realization that the community he had once fought for had grown fearful. His supporters were scattered, cautious of any connection to him, unwilling to take the same risks he had taken. The movement he had built, the cause he had sacrificed so much for, now lay in tatters, fractured by his time in prison and the ever-watchful eye of the state. Yet despite the obstacles, Mikhail's resolve never faltered. He knew he couldn't allow them to bury his voice or silence his fight. Slowly, quietly, he began to reach out, reconnecting with those who still believed in his cause. He organized small gatherings, whispered conversations in safe places, careful to avoid the authorities' radar. Bit by bit, he started to rebuild his network, gathering people who shared his vision, who refused to let fear dictate their lives. It was different now, more cautious, more restrained, but Mikhail's determination remained unbroken. He would find a way to continue, to reclaim the voice they had tried to silence. He had survived prison, endured their worst, and he wasn't about to surrender his purpose now. No matter how many obstacles they put in his path, Mikhail was unwilling to back down. His fight was far from over, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Mikhail's quiet return to activism gained momentum, it wasn't long before the authorities took notice. They hadn't released him with the expectation that he would stay silent. They had counted on his spirit being crushed, his influence diminished. But the persistence of his defiance was a thorn in their side, and they were determined to remove it once and for all. Soon, the weight of surveillance pressed down on him once more, heavier and more invasive than ever. It started with the familiar feeling of being watched. Footsteps echoing behind him on quiet streets, cars lingering outside his home late into the night. Strangers began appearing at his meetings, their faces unfamiliar, their questions veiled in polite curiosity, but laced with the unmistakable intent to gather information. Friends warned him that plainclothes officers were asking about him, seeking out anyone he spoke to, mapping his every connection. The state was rebuilding its web around him, tightening the strands with each passing day. The scrutiny didn't stop at observation. It was clear that the authorities were sending him a message, an unspoken warning that they could strike again whenever they chose. He received ominous phone calls at odd hours, the line silent on the other end before disconnecting. And the threats weren't confined to him alone. One of his closest allies, a young activist who had joined his cause with unwavering enthusiasm, began receiving warnings at his place of work. "Keep your distance from Savostin," they said, their words cold and unmistakable. "This is your only warning." These tactics served to isolate Mikhail further, as his friends and allies became increasingly wary of their association with him. They knew that any contact with him placed them under scrutiny too, that their lives and livelihoods were now part of the state's game. Some tried to stay away, fearful of the risks, while others offered cautious support, reaching out in secrecy, risking everything just to stand by him. The constant surveillance was suffocating, an unrelenting reminder that his every move was monitored, dissected, documented. In public, police would approach him casually, their questions seemingly harmless, yet their intentions clear. "Where are you headed, Mr. Savostin?" they would ask, their smiles thin and calculated. Just checking in, making sure everything is in order. It was a performance of power, a constant reminder that he was under their control, and any misstep would bring consequences. Despite the pressure, Mikhail refused to be intimidated. He knew that giving in would mean accepting defeat, letting them control not just his actions but his very beliefs. So he moved carefully, adjusting his plans to avoid detection, meeting with allies in secluded places, communicating in ways that evaded prying eyes. The tension was thick, a constant reminder that one wrong move could cost him his freedom, or worse. But Mikhail was willing to take that risk, for he understood that his silence would only serve their agenda. The state was watching, waiting ready to act at the first sign of weakness. But Mikhail knew that he couldn't let fear dictate his life. His cause was too important, his conviction too strong. He would move forward, whatever the risks, knowing that his fight was far from over and that his defiance was the only weapon he had left. In the face of relentless pressure, Mikhail knew he needed allies. His cause had outgrown the borders of Mineralny Vody, reaching people across Russia who shared his vision of justice and change. Quietly, he began reaching out, forging connections with others who had also suffered under the system and were ready to push back. These weren't just alliances, they were lifelines, strands of hope that together they might be stronger. One of the most significant connections he made was with Boris Nemtsov, a prominent opposition figure who had built a reputation as one of the few willing to challenge the state openly. Nemtsov had once held government office, knew the inner workings of the system, and had become a symbol of defiance for many across Russia. Through whispered introductions and carefully arranged meetings, Mikhail and Boris found a shared purpose. Nemtsov saw in Mikhail a tenacity that inspired even the most seasoned activists, while Mikhail found in Nemtsov a mentor, someone who gave his fight a sense of legitimacy and direction. Their partnership gave Mikhail's movement a new level of credibility. With Nemtsov's support, Mikhail was no longer just a local activist but part of a broader network, connected to a movement with national reach. Together, they began to strategize, discussing ways to expose corruption and raise awareness beyond the small circles of resistance. Their alliance strengthened his fight, bringing in resources and connections that Mikhail could never have accessed alone. The state, of course, noticed this growing network, and Mikhail could feel their gaze sharpening, their impatience simmering as his movement gained momentum. Through Nemtsov, Mikhail connected with a wider circle of activists, journalists, lawyers, organizers, each committed to holding those in power accountable. These were people who understood the stakes, who had risked their own safety and freedom for a chance at change. They taught Mikhail new tactics, ways to protect himself and his allies, methods of communication that could evade the ever-watchful eye of the state. But these new bonds came with a heightened sense of risk. Every meeting was planned with precision, every conversation measured. He knew that if one link in the chain were broken, it could unravel the entire network, putting lives and movements at risk. Yet in each ally he gained, Mikhail saw the strength of his cause growing, bolstered by the shared belief that change was possible. These alliances gave Mikhail not only strength, but a renewed sense of hope. He no longer felt like a lone voice against a vast machine. He was part of something larger, something that carried the weight of countless people's dreams and struggles. And with every handshake, every plan whispered under the shadow of secrecy, he felt his fight gaining power. The network they built was fragile, but it was alive, a force that, one day, might be strong enough to bring change. And with each new ally, Mikhail grew more determined, knowing that together they were building a resistance that could no longer be ignored. Mikhail's growing network and the momentum of his movement hadn't gone unnoticed. The state saw his alliances, especially with high-profile figures like Boris Nemtsov, as a direct threat. He was no longer just an activist from a small town. He had become a symbol of defiance. And this time, they were determined to make an example of him. One night, as he returned home from a meeting with fellow activists, a squad of officers was waiting for him. They didn't bother with polite words or empty explanations. They shoved him into the back of a van without warning, the cold metal pressing into his wrists as they cuffed him tightly, almost painfully. The officers remained silent, their expressions void of empathy as the van roared to life, carrying him back into the grip of the system he had fought so hard to expose. At the station, the charges against him were more severe, more carefully constructed than before. This time, they accused him of inciting insurrection, of conspiring to destabilize the government, charges that carried the gravest penalties. They didn't need evidence. They only needed to cast doubt, to stain his name in a way that would silence him permanently. He knew that these charges were designed not just to imprison him, but to destroy his reputation, to erase any legitimacy his movement had gained. The interrogations were harsher, relentless in their intensity. The officers taunted him, pushing him for names, trying to break his resolve. They wanted him to confess, to give them a reason, any reason, to justify the punishment they had planned. But Mikhail stayed silent, meeting each question with the same calm defiance that had become his trademark. The harder they pressed, the stronger he seemed to grow, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crack. But the physical treatment he endured was brutal. Days passed in darkness, punctuated by only the rough handling of guards who dragged him between cells and interrogation rooms. Sleep deprivation, isolation, hours spent in cramped, freezing cells with no bedding. These were just a few of the methods they used to break him down, to make him feel small, helpless, powerless. At one point, they left him in a solitary confinement cell for days, the small, windowless room pressing in on him, the silence suffocating. He could feel his mind beginning to fray, the effects of sleepless nights and relentless pressure gnawing at his resilience. But each time he felt himself nearing the edge, he would close his eyes, reminding himself of why he was here. He thought of his family, his friends, the people who had whispered their thanks to him, the young activists who looked to him as a beacon of courage. These thoughts became his anchor, his shield against the darkness that surrounded him. The guards grew frustrated by his resistance. They began to escalate their tactics, using every tool they had to remind him of their power. They kept him isolated, but the faint sounds of other prisoners, cries, shouts, murmurs, reached his ears, a reminder of the countless others who had faced the same brutality. He wasn't alone in his suffering, and he drew strength from that knowledge, finding solace in the shared endurance of those unseen voices. Mikhail knew that this imprisonment was different from the first. This time, they intended to break him completely, to strip him of everything he believed in. But no matter how much they tried to shatter his body and mind, they couldn't touch the core of who he was. His spirit remained his own, unyielding in the face of cruelty. Every day he survived was a small act of defiance, a reminder to himself and to his captors that they could control his body, but they couldn't possess his soul. The state had escalated the stakes, determined to crush him. But in their relentless pursuit of his silence, they only fueled his inner fire, strengthening his resolve to keep fighting, no matter the cost. Inside the cold walls of his cell, Mikhail quickly realized that survival required more than endurance. The brutal conditions took their toll physically, but it was the mental strain, the isolation, the constant reminders of his captor's power that threatened to break him. He knew he would have to rely on more than his own strength. He would need to find a way to stay connected to his purpose, to the principles that had brought him here. He developed routines, small rituals that helped anchor him in a world where time had lost all meaning. Each morning, he would press his back against the rough stone wall and stretch, moving slowly through exercises he'd memorized, each motion a defiant act of keeping his body strong in the face of their attempts to weaken him. He rationed his energy, learning to conserve strength during the hardest days, focusing his mind on the memories of freedom and the people he cared for outside. These routines became a lifeline, a way of reminding himself that he still had control over his mind, his spirit. Mikhail wasn't alone in his suffering, and he soon found himself reaching out to other prisoners, men who had been cast aside by the same system that sought to silence him. During rare moments when he was able to work alongside them or share a brief word, he would offer small gestures of solidarity. A nod, a whispered encouragement, or a shared look that conveyed more than words ever could. Slowly, these moments of connection turned into a network of resilience, a silent but powerful bond that united them against their common oppressors. The guards noticed, and they tried to break these connections. They separated prisoners who seemed close, shuffled cell assignments, and cracked down on any hint of solidarity. But Mikhail and his fellow inmates adapted, communicating through coded taps on walls, passing messages disguised as casual remarks. The prison's silence was broken by these whispers of defiance, a quiet reminder that they were not alone. One day, Mikhail met Pavel, a young man who had been imprisoned for simply attending a protest. Pavel was frail, his spirit visibly shaken by the experience. He had never anticipated the cruelty he would face for such a small act of defiance, and the weight of it had nearly crushed him. Seeing this, Mikhail took him under his wing, offering words of strength and guidance. "They can't take everything from you," he told Pavel quietly. "As long as you hold on to what matters, they can't win." In time, Mikhail watched as Pavel regained some of his strength, his eyes brightening with a flicker of the courage that had first led him to protest. Through these interactions, Mikhail became a figure of quiet leadership within the prison, a man others looked to for strength when their own reserves ran low. He encouraged them to find small acts of defiance, ways to preserve their dignity. Some began sharing what little food they had, others offered encouragement to those who faltered. Together, they became a community, a family forged in the crucible of oppression. Mikhail's influence did not go unnoticed. The guards grew increasingly frustrated by his ability to inspire, sensing that their control over him was slipping. They tried isolating him, keeping him away from others for days on end, but by then, the bonds had already been forged. His presence lingered, even in his absence, as the men continued to support one another, each of them strengthened by the example he had set. For Mikhail, these moments of solidarity were more than survival. They were acts of resistance. Every day that they held on to each other, every time they defied the prison's dehumanizing grip, they reminded themselves that they were still men, still free in the ways that mattered most. They might have been captives, but they refused to be conquered. In this way, Mikhail sustained himself and his fellow prisoners, creating a legacy of resilience that no amount of brutality could erase. Together, they endured, not just as individuals, but as a unified force against the oppression that sought to destroy them. As the months in prison stretched on, the relentless conditions began to take a severe toll on Mikhail's health. The deprivation, the constant cold, and the bare minimum of food chipped away at his body. He could feel himself weakening, his strength fading with each passing day, his resilience forced to bear not only the mental strain of captivity, but the physical cost as well. Yet even as his health deteriorated, his spirit remained unbroken. He would not let them take that from him. But when the guards pushed even further, reducing his rations, extending his isolation, Mikhail knew he had to take a stand. The only way he could make himself heard was through a hunger strike. It was a dangerous choice, one that risked his life, but he knew that this act of defiance was his last resort. He began refusing food, his quiet protest a statement to the guards, to the system that sought to break him. He would rather starve than submit. The days of the hunger strike bled into each other, a grueling test of endurance as his body weakened further. Guards taunted him, jeering at his foolishness, telling him that no one outside cared, that his sacrifice was pointless. But Mikhail held fast, his mind focused on the purpose behind his strike, the determination that fueled him even as his body faltered. It was a silent battle, one he fought alone, yet he felt the solidarity of those who had come to rely on his strength, even if they could not join him in this protest. Eventually, the toll became undeniable. His body, stretched to its limits, began to show signs of collapse. He suffered dizzy spells, his vision blurred, and each breath felt heavier than the last. He knew he was nearing the edge, and with that awareness came a difficult realization. If he stayed here, if he continued this fight within these walls, it would only be a matter of time before they succeeded in breaking him one way or another. In that fragile state, Mikhail made a decision that weighed heavily on his heart. He realized that to continue his fight for justice, he would need to seek freedom beyond Russia's borders. It was a choice he hadn't anticipated, one that meant leaving behind everything he knew, everyone he cared about. But he understood that his impact had outgrown the confines of his own suffering. He could do more outside of these walls, in a place where he could continue his fight without the chains of oppression pulling him down. The decision was bittersweet, tinged with the pain of separation. But Mikhail knew it was his only option, his best chance to keep fighting the regime that had taken so much from him and so many others. If he could escape, he could give voice to the countless stories of injustice he had witnessed, the cries of those who remained silenced behind prison walls. He could become the voice they couldn't stifle, the advocate they needed to bring light to the shadows they endured. With that resolve, Mikhail began to plan, his mind sharpening with a renewed sense of purpose. The journey would be dangerous, the path uncertain, but he knew that beyond Russia's borders lay the freedom he needed to continue his fight. And with each fragile breath, his desire for justice only grew stronger, fueling the courage he would need to make his escape. Mikhail's decision to leave Russia was one of the hardest choices he had ever made. He had dedicated his life to fighting for justice in his homeland, to standing up for those who had no voice. The streets of Mineralny Vody, the places he had known since childhood, the people who had come to depend on him, leaving all of that behind felt like an unbearable weight pressing on his heart. Yet he knew that staying meant certain defeat, an end to his fight without ever having the chance to make a real difference. In those quiet moments alone, he wrestled with the pain of separation. He thought of his family, his friends, the countless people who had shown him silent support even in the face of their own fears. To leave them felt like abandoning them, a betrayal of the promises he had made to stand up for them no matter the cost. But as much as he wished he could stay and fight on home soil, he understood that he could no longer do so effectively within the oppressive confines of Russia's borders. To continue his mission, to honor the sacrifices that so many had made alongside him, he would have to find freedom elsewhere. Leaving meant safety, but it also meant sacrifice. Mikhail knew that, even if he managed to escape, he would forever be a man without a country. He would carry Russia in his heart, but he would be separated from its soil, from the people who had given his fight meaning. It was a bittersweet realization. Freedom came at a cost, one that would leave a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. But as the days passed, he grew more certain that this was the only way forward. In the end, it was the faces of those he had fought for that gave him the strength to let go. He reminded himself that leaving was not the end of his struggle, it was a continuation of it. From abroad, he could shine a light on the injustices he had witnessed, tell the stories of those still trapped in silence, advocate for change with a freedom he couldn't find at home. And maybe, just maybe, he could build a new platform to amplify the voices of those who couldn't leave, those who still fought in the shadows. So, with a heart heavy with loss, but steady with purpose, Mikhail prepared to leave the country he loved, knowing that his journey would take him far, but that his fight would remain rooted in the soil of Russia. He was leaving, but his dedication to justice, to his homeland, would stay with him as strong as ever. Mikhail's escape from Russia was as perilous as it was carefully planned. Every step was a gamble. Every step was a gamble, every movement shadowed by the fear that one misstep could mean capture, and an even darker fate than before. He had no margin for error. The authorities were watching, and he knew they wouldn't allow him to simply slip away unnoticed. This was a journey that would test not only his endurance but his nerve, his ability to stay calm in the face of constant danger. With the help of trusted allies, he had mapped a route that avoided major roads and official checkpoints. He would travel in silence, moving under cover of night, careful to blend into the shadows. The journey would take him across borders, through remote forests and back roads, each mile carrying him further from the reach of those who wanted him silenced. His allies provided him with a forged passport and basic supplies, but beyond that, he was on his own. On the first night, as he slipped out of the town he had known all his life, Mikhail felt the weight of his decisions settle over him. He was leaving behind everything familiar, risking everything he had left for a chance at freedom. The roads were empty, but he could feel his heart pounding with each step, an acute awareness that at any moment, a single set of headlights or a shadow in the trees could end it all. At one point, nearing a checkpoint he couldn't avoid, Mikhail's heart raced as he approached the guards stationed along the border. His mind raced with contingencies, each scenario playing out with unsettling clarity. But he steadied himself, calming his breathing, reminding himself to blend in. With a nod and a quick word, he presented his forged passport, holding his breath as the guard inspected it. Time seemed to stretch unbearably as the guard's eyes lingered on the document, his gaze moving up to Mikhail's face with a moment's suspicion. Mikhail forced himself to maintain eye contact, calm but unyielding. After a tense pause, the guard handed it back, and Mikhail moved on, resisting the urge to look back as he disappeared into the night. But the journey was far from over. The next days were a blur of constant movement, winding through forests, crossing hidden paths, and stopping only when exhaustion became too much to bear. Each day was a calculated risk, each night another step away from the watchful eyes that he knew would be looking for him. There were close calls along the way, times when a sudden noise in the trees or the distant sound of voices would send a spike of fear through his body. Once, he stumbled upon a group of soldiers on a patrol route he hadn't anticipated. He quickly dropped to the ground, lying still among the dense underbrush, his heartbeat hammering in his ears as he waited, barely daring to breathe until the sound of footsteps faded. As he drew closer to the final border crossing, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He had been moving for days, his body pushed beyond its limits, surviving on little more than determination and the promise of freedom. He could feel the toll, the fatigue, the aching muscles, the gnawing hunger, but he pushed through, knowing that he was so close to something that had felt impossible for so long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the border. This was the last checkpoint, the final barrier between him and freedom. He approached it with steady nerves, relying on the skills he had honed over days of evasion and survival. With one last flash of his forged documents and a silent prayer, he crossed into foreign soil, a surge of relief washing over him as he realized he had made it. He was free. But even as he took his first steps into freedom, Mikhail felt the weight of his mission settle back onto his shoulders. His journey wasn't over. This escape was just the beginning of a new chapter. Behind him lay a homeland that still needed him, and ahead lay a future filled with unknowns. But for the first time in years, he could move without fear, speak without restraint, and continue his fight for justice with a voice that could not be silenced. With each step, Mikhail felt the shackles of oppression fall away, replaced by the promise of what lay ahead, a promise to himself and to those he had left behind, that he would continue to fight for the freedom they all deserved. Arriving in the US was like stepping into another world. For the first time in years, Mikhail felt the absence of fear. He could move freely, speak openly, and for the first time in a long time, he knew he was truly safe. Yet, as the relief settled in, so did the bittersweet weight of what he had left behind. Freedom had come at a cost, and the distance between him and Russia felt vast, unbridgeable. In his new surroundings, everything felt unfamiliar. The streets, the language, even the air seemed different, a reminder that he was far from the place he still considered home. But despite the strangeness, Mikhail saw this as an opportunity, a chance to continue his fight on a different stage, one where his voice could carry without fear of retribution. He knew he would use this freedom to amplify the stories of those who couldn't leave, those still enduring the struggle he had escaped. Adjusting to a life without constant surveillance, without the ever-present threat of arrest, felt liberating but also unsettling. At times, he caught himself looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the shadows that had once followed him. But slowly, he began to embrace this new life, learning to trust in his safety, feeling the strength that freedom gave him to continue his mission with renewed purpose. In his heart, Mikhail knew his journey in Russia had not ended. It had only transformed. From this new vantage point, he could advocate louder, connect with supporters around the world, and shine a light on the injustices that remained hidden back home. The miles between him and Russia did nothing to lessen his commitment. Instead, they fueled him, reminding him that he now had a responsibility to make the most of the freedom he had fought so hard to secure. And so, in this new land, Mikhail began to rebuild, not just a life, but a platform, a mission reborn. He was free, but his dedication to justice would forever keep him bound to the place and the people he had left behind. In the quiet moments of his new life, Mikhail often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Each memory felt vivid, almost surreal. The moments of small triumphs, the crushing blows of loss, the nights when he questioned if he could endure, and the mornings when he'd wake, resolve hardening despite the hardships he faced. He had lived through trials that tested him in ways he hadn't thought possible, yet here he was, on the other side, carrying the weight of those experiences like stones in his pockets. As he reflected, Mikhail thought of the people who had inspired him along the way. He remembered the shopkeepers, the teachers, the young activists who had risked so much to stand beside him. He could still see their faces, the gratitude in their eyes, their silent messages of support, even when it meant danger to themselves. They were part of him now, as much a part of his journey as his own blood and bone. And it was for them that he had carried on, that he had resisted the pull of despair, refusing to give in even when he felt abandoned by the world. Those days in prison had forged something unbreakable within him, a deeper understanding of what it meant to fight for something beyond oneself. He had experienced firsthand the cruelty of an unjust system, one that used fear and punishment to control people, to rob them of their voices and their hope. And in facing that system, Mikhail had found a cause that transcended any single life. He knew that he hadn't endured all he had just to live quietly in freedom. He was here with a purpose, a mission that had grown even stronger in his heart. Now, in his newfound freedom, his mission had expanded. He saw himself as a bridge, a way to connect those on the outside with the reality of those still trapped within the confines of oppression. Every time he spoke about his experiences, every interview he gave, every article he wrote, he was carrying those voices forward, giving a platform to those still silenced. His role wasn't to tell his own story alone. It was to amplify the stories of those who remained unheard, of those who still lived in fear, of those who hadn't yet found the strength to speak out. He had come to realize that freedom was more than just the absence of chains. It was the ability to shape one's life, to stand without fear, to know that one's voice mattered. That was the freedom he fought for now, not just for himself, but for everyone who remained captive to fear and injustice. The distance between him and his homeland had only strengthened his commitment. For as long as he had a voice, he would use it to speak for those who could not. Looking back, Mikhail understood that his journey wasn't simply a story of survival. It was a story of transformation, of purpose forged in the fires of adversity. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, that his work was far from over. But he had no doubts. Every sacrifice, every wound, every hardship had brought him to this moment, a moment he would honor by carrying his fight forward for as long as he was able. For Mikhail, the journey was no longer about him alone. It was about the people he had left behind, the ones who had given him the strength to survive, and the unyielding commitment to continue the fight for justice, hope, and freedom. For Russia, and for all who believed in a better future. Mikhail's story quickly became more than just a tale of personal resilience. It evolved into a symbol of courage for countless others facing injustice. His journey, from the quiet streets of Mineralnaya Vody to the walls of prison, and finally to freedom, resonated far beyond his experiences. It became a testament to the strength of those who refused to back down, even in the face of overwhelming power. For those still living under oppression, his story represented something rare and precious: hope. Around the world, people who heard Mikhail's story found inspiration in his unyielding spirit. Activists in similar struggles saw in him a role model, someone who had withstood the worst of his government's retribution and come out the other side unbroken. Young people, in particular, looked to him as a reminder that one voice, even when isolated, could still make a powerful difference. Mikhail's journey had shown them that fear didn't have to dictate their lives, that standing up, even in small ways, could plant the seeds of change. Mikhail's legacy extended to his homeland as well. For those who remained in Russia, his story served as a silent rallying cry. Despite the state's efforts to erase him, to silence him, his impact lived on. Underground networks circulated his stories, quietly sharing his words and his message of resistance. People took inspiration from resilience, finding ways to resist in their own lives, however subtle or small. In him, they saw proof that dignity and courage could endure, even in the most challenging circumstances. As Mikhail continued his work in freedom, he became more than just an activist. He became a symbol. His story crossed borders and generations, touching those who had never met him but who recognized the courage it took to stand against injustice. He had given a voice to those who had none, reminding them that they, too, held power. His resilience showed that even when the odds seem insurmountable, there remains a path forward, a way to fight, no matter how dark the journey might become. Through his story, Mikhail had become a beacon of strength, a reminder to all who heard his tale that true freedom is never just given, It is earned, fought for, and protected by those brave enough to claim it. And in every heart he touched, the flame of his resistance lived on, inspiring a generation to believe in a world where justice could prevail. Mikhail's journey reminds us that the fight for freedom is never truly over, that it requires courage not just from individuals but from entire communities. His resilience and his commitment to justice stand as a powerful example of what it means to defy oppression, even when the personal cost is immense. Mikhail's story is both a warning and an inspiration, reminding us that the rights we sometimes take for granted can be threatened, and that defending them requires vigilance from all of us. Today, Mikhail continues his work with a tireless dedication, sharing his story to expose the injustices he witnessed and to give a voice to those still suffering in silence. Through his advocacy, he urges the world to pay attention to those who cannot speak up for themselves, to the individuals trapped behind walls of oppression, stripped of their voices and freedoms. His journey shows us that freedom is not a privilege, but a fundamental right that must be defended and upheld, even if it means standing alone. This is where each of us has a role to play. Mikhail's story may seem far removed, but its lessons are universal, reminding us that the fight for justice spans continents, cultures, and languages. We can honor his sacrifices and his unwavering spirit by taking action ourselves, by supporting organizations that protect human rights, by raising awareness of political prisoners and oppressed communities, and by refusing to turn a blind eye to injustices happening anywhere in the world. In doing so, we don't just share Mikhail's message, we strengthen it. Each of you has the power to be a part of this movement. Follow Mikhail's journey, share his story with others, and consider supporting groups and causes that advocate for freedom and justice. Let his journey inspire a call to action, a reminder that every voice raised against injustice adds strength to the cause of freedom. Each of us, wherever we are, can stand in solidarity with those still oppressed, pushing back against silence and fear with hope and resilience. Together, let us honor Mikhail's journey by becoming part of the fight for freedom, justice, and dignity for all. Let his story remind us that while oppression may hold power, it can never truly silence the human spirit. Not when people like you choose to stand with those who continue the fight. The journey for justice is ongoing, and it needs each of us. Join Mikhail and countless others around the world in carrying this torch forward, ensuring that voices demanding freedom are never silenced again.